I see Juliet has joined us. Welcome, Juliet. We'll give a few more minutes for a couple of more people to join in, and then we'll start. Right. Yes. Good evening, Juliet. Unfortunately, the chat section has not been enabled for this particular tea time talk. So if you do have a comment or a question, you can put that in the Q&A section. Good evening, everybody. My hope is that even though we don't have a very full house this evening, that this particular recording, because it's part and parcel of a current workforce reform project under HEE with BAPO, will be made available on YouTube for everyone to be able to play back and see, which will be quite useful. I'm particularly excited today because I'm really looking forward to seeing all the work that Bev's been doing over the past few months. This webinar in particular is going to share and get feedback on the development of practice-based learning framework for the P&O workforce. And I think that's quite something that we haven't been able to explore over the last few years. And with this framework, we're hoping that it will introduce, the concept and structure in key areas and how that work can complement other frameworks in existence. There will be a Q&A session, and for the people who are here today, I'm hoping to have us really engage with the session. So your comments, questions, please dig it all in and drop that in the Q&A section. And if for any chance you want to come up and actually speak, just raise your hands and we will let you on and you can speak on that. I also have Sandy here today with me, who would also be helping to facilitate the session. And to introduce our speaker for today, the one and only Dr. Beverly Durant. She is working with BAPO and has been working with us on this project for a while now. She is from the Vectors Healthcare Solution and is an SME providing specialist in health-related education, learning, workforce reform, and she's a subject matter expert within this consultancy. Bev has worked in a number of projects, especially within leadership, amongst other different AHPs. She's a podiatrist by profession, and I'm so happy to be working with her. So I'll be handing over to you, Bev, to take over and probably do a better introduction to the topic. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. Welcome everybody, and thank you, Krista, for your kind introduction. So yes, Krista has alluded to the fact that I am a podiatrist by training, but I am absolutely delighted and thankful to have the opportunity to work with another professional group in such a strategic and collaborative way. So I'd like to thank all of the prosthetists and orthotists out there for allowing me that privilege. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about the practice-based learning framework, which is one of the things that I'm leading on for the workforce reform project. And we're going to start off with a healthy metaphor. So this is my metaphor. It's about building. Just as you thought you were going to hear about practice-based learning, we're going to move on to building houses. But just bear with me. I think it's quite a good metaphor to have in mind as we progress through. And I just want to pose this question to you. So if I told you that the person that you just entrusted to build your house had completed 75% of their training, focused on the 25% of the requirements of the job, would it cause you concern, and would it cause you to question the quality of the build that you might get? So just bearing that in mind when we go through, because in this example, it looks like that we've got some really good solid foundations, which is everything is built on solid foundations, so that's fantastic. But we also want to be assured that our builder can safely put the walls up, put the roof on, put all the dividing walls in, and put our windows in. And that's really what this whole thing is about. This is about having the right skills in the right amount at the right time to enable us to do the job that we need to do. So as we progress through the presentation, I'm going to pose 4 questions. So the first question is, what is a quality learning environment? So we hear a lot of talk around at the moment about providing quality learning environments. So we're going to explore that a little bit. We're going to look at what are the drivers behind the work that we're doing, and in particular, we're going to be talking about the practice-based learning framework in that context. How can learners understand the 4 pillars of professional practice? And then we'll go on a little journey as to why we're talking about 4 pillars of professional practice, which are often associated with advancing practice. And then the final question is, what can the PBL framework influence and change? So let's just explore, to start with, the first question around quality learning environments. So there's two references here that you can explore and peruse at your own pace. But what I liked about some of the work, so this is 2 groups of researchers that are exploring quality and clinical learning environments. And I think these 2 quotes from the work are really well placed for this presentation. So the first one is around building effective and supportive quality learning environments, and it places the quality and safety of patient care front and centre, as you would expect. But it also alludes to the fact that quality and learning environments also respect the health and well-being of the medical workforce, to the trainee learning, and interestingly, it moves on to talk about the socialization into the profession. So it's a preparation as much as it is about everything else. And that professional identity is so important for what we go on to do throughout our careers. And then the second part of that is about the quality learning environment and how influential it is. So this quote, the quality of the learning environment that provided the context for training was a predictor of the quality of care provided by graduates for years after graduation. And I think that's really quite a poignant place to pause for a moment, because I can remember when I was training to be a podiatrist many, many years ago, I can remember my practice educator standing right there next to me. I can remember what she looked like, what she sounded like. I can remember the quickness of her skills that I thought I'd never be able to attain. And I remember I was there forever trying to bevel this semi-compressed felt pad, making a terrible job of it. And she came and she just went, ooh, quickly beveled it perfectly. And I thought, wow, I hope one day I'll be able to get there. But it just shows the impact and the power and the influence that our educational and our educators can have over our future development. And that goes for positive experiences and negative experiences. So when we're building that quality learning environment, it's really important that we keep in our mind what image we're giving the recipient, the learner, because it's really important, because it's long lasting. And as I say, I can still remember exactly what my practice educator looks like and sounded like. I can still hear her voice. Okay, so the next thing to talk about then is what the drivers are behind this work. So of course, it is about driving innovation in pre-registration practice-based learning. So this is about pre-reg learning. Practice learning capability and capacity. So this is about looking at, can we do things differently? how can we do things differently? Why do we need to do things differently? And where can we expand on the areas that perhaps are not particularly strong, and how can we consolidate the areas that are strong? And then how do we build sustainable growth in terms of improving the pipeline into the profession? And I come from a small profession. It's bigger than P&O, but it's a small profession. And I think those small and vital professions, it's so important to be able to build a sustainable future. And we know that we have lots of challenges around joiners and leavers to the profession, around attrition and retention. And I think we've got to start from a grassroots level in terms of building a sustainable model moving forward. And we also need to recognise that we've got a different and a new generation of learners. So not just because we're talking about Gen Z, but also because within our NHS practice, within our professional practice, we've got a new generation of learners that are coming through a different route. So we've got a whole new raft of apprenticeships, both at our support level and our pre-registration level 6, and onwards and upwards to level 7. So we need to ensure that the narrative that we build around practice-based learning moves away from just describing our environment as a placement environment, because actually our apprentices are not on placement, they're employees. And so we need to just change that narrative slightly. And we also need to make sure that we explore the full depth and breadth of what can be provided in a practice-based learning environment. We've got huge amounts of support to help us do that. And we know that this is about bridging the gap between education and work. We need to optimise and recognise the capability of students and new registrants. We need to make robust foundations for ongoing professional development. And we need to make our learning environments optimal and making them learner focused. And we need to provide early and robust foundations for career progression. And if we look at the strategy for AHPs, it's brilliant that AHPs are front and centre to providing quality care within an NHS setting. And it's brilliant that they're, I wish I was training now, because there are so many opportunities now for new graduates. And the training has just changed beyond recognition if I think back to when I trained. So I think we're in a really strong place. And we've got lots of different approaches that we can use. And I think, we're challenged to look at the depth and the breadth of what we provide in practice-based learning. And this is where the 4 pillars of practice come in, and I'll explain a bit more about that as we move on. And then we've also got the quality framework, which gives us huge amounts of reassurance and guides us in certain directions. And if we look at the refreshed quality framework, those 6 domains, one of which is developing and supporting learners. And then the other reason, one of the other drivers, is that our practice is changing. Our scope of practice is changing, and that's the same for prosthetists and orthotists as it is for podiatrists. And we're being asked to do things differently with our regulator. So we've got a new set of stops that are coming into being in September. And that's asking us to do things differently. So that brings me on to talking a little bit about the 4 pillars of practice. And so you might be wondering, why are we talking about the 4 pillars of practice? And there's a lovely definition that's been provided for us by HEE that you can read. And certainly what we're not doing here is asking our learners to practice at a level which is that we can align to advancing practice. So we're not asking them to work autonomously. We're not asking them at this level of, as a learner, to make complex decisions about somebody's care. And we're not suggesting that we should be altering the level of training to a master's level. But what we are saying is that there is an expectation for new graduates about how they can shape and develop their career. And there is an expectation that our learners will embrace the 4 pillars of practice, of clinical practice, leadership and management, education and research, and have a core and specific area of clinical competence. So if we have that expectation, we need to put some preparation in place to enable that to happen. And these are characteristically what we see as the 4 pillars. So we've adapted these slightly for this practice-based learning framework. So, and this is about trying to look at different ways of providing what's core and what's essential, which I think we can all say is around that clinical skills acquisition component. But it's also looking at the other areas where new graduates will be expected to be able to develop and to gain experience in. And this also gives us the opportunity to explore growth-based careers, portfolio careers, because not everybody wants to progress in a vertical fashion. So by including the 4 pillars as part of our narrative, it gives opportunities for a lateral expansion of learning as well. And we need to make sure that we recognise that the direction of travel isn't necessarily always going to be to move up, and that it's perfectly okay to want to have a lateral shift. And we also need to make sure that if we're going to have an expectation that when our new graduates are in post, that we've introduced this concept at a very early stage in their career. And one way of doing that, as well as ticking some of those other boxes that we talked about earlier, is to embed the 4 pillars within a practice-based learning environment approach. So if we just pause for a moment and think about the practice-based learning framework itself. So I'm going to take you through and introduce you to what it looks like, and then we're going to feed in the other bits of what we've talked about and how we can possibly include some of that information around the 4 pillars. How can that be included into a practice-based learning model? So the next question is, what can the PBL framework influence and change? And to my mind, there's 3 main areas. So we can look at the model, we can look at the activity, and we can look at the supervision. So if we just spend a couple of moments just exploring each of these. So within this practice-based learning framework, it puts the learner at the forefront of the experience. And as I said, it asks us to consider using practice-based learning as our narrative rather than placement. And that's in recognition that actually we have different groups of learners, and we have we need to try and provide a different breadth and approach to what would traditionally be called a placement. And I don't know about you, but if someone says to me, oh, this group of students are going out on clinical placement, then it kind of like conjures up an image that they're actually going to be doing a clinical skills acquisition piece. But actually what we're being asked to look at here is how can we broaden that narrative to include these other areas that we're being asked to include, and that, you know, our standards of proficiency from our regulator are asking us to include different things in that practice-based learning environment that we place students in and learners in. So the model, the narrative that we use around that model, the activity. So activity can come in many different ways, moving away from just gaining our clinical skills, which is obviously fundamental and very important. But what else can we do with the time that we've got in those practice-based learning environments? And then the supervision model also allows us to explore different ways that our learners can help each other. So traditionally, and I think it's probably the same for prosthetics and orthotics as it is in podiatry, there's a very heavy emphasis on this one-to-one model of supervision. And by just changing that supervision model to include some peer-to-peer or near-peer supervision, or have different types of learners, so students and apprentices learning together, they can offer each other different things, different experiences, different levels of support. And it also helps feed into this notion that, you know, lifelong learning, and we can see in some pockets across the country where there is an underutilization of placement capacity, and that's for lots of different reasons. But if we had opportunities for facilitating learning embedded within our business as usual, then it gets that mindset of being an educator as just part and parcel of your role. So not only does it offer learners to learn from each other in a peer-supported or a near-peer way, it also, if you're helping a fellow learner consolidate something, or you're doing some sort of peer-to-peer learning, then that makes you think slightly differently about when you're a new graduate in a placement setting, in a practice-based learning environment, that it's just a normal part of your role to be having learners with you and learning from each other. So it can be pretty inspirational. Okay, so in terms of how the PBL framework is organised, so as I said, it's learner focused. So it has 12 learning statements, which are phrased as opportunities for the learner, and they are all mapped to the HCPC stops. And then there are 4 clusters of clinical learning, which are mapped to those practice-based learning statements. And then for each area, there is some sample activity about what could be provided in that practice-based learning environment. And then all of the activity is also mapped to the 4 pillars of practice. So embedding the concept, so not that we have an expectation that students are going to do more and more complex stuff in their clinical learning environments, but it's about embedding the concept that there are different areas that you need to explore as a new graduate, and there is an expectation that you will have experience across all 4. So in terms of the statements, now this is, I apologise for the size of the text, but I just wanted to show you the sort of phrasing of the learning statement. So there's 12 learning statements phrased as what opportunities can be provided. And I just want to pick off some examples here that we can align to the 4 pillars of practice. So here, number 4, opportunities to engage in reflective practice activity to enable, renew, and self-evaluation of clinical practice development and appreciate the role of lifelong learning. So facilitated learning sits quite nicely with that one. And if we go down to number 11, similarly, opportunities to promote and engage in the learning of others. This could be with patients, peers, or members of the wider healthcare team. And it may include peer-to-peer or near-peer support and supervision. So that's what I was talking about, what we can do differently. How can we influence things slightly differently? So that learning out statement maps well to the 4 pillars of clinical practice, but it also gives us opportunities to look at that supervision model and do something differently there. And then number 12, opportunities for participating in leadership activities, recognizing that leadership is a skill that all professionals can demonstrate at all levels. And that's embedded within the updated SOPs that are coming out in September, or be implemented in September. And also by having more than one student, so by moving away from a 1-to-1 model into a 2-to-1 or a 3-to-1 and having different groups of learners learning together, it also gives you opportunities for exploring things differently. So putting in place leadership opportunities, which could be, you know, one learner could be doing a clinical skills, you know, few days in clinical practice, but equally, you could be going off and doing a project placement, which is perhaps looking at some sort of service improvement. And one learner could take the lead for that. So it offers a kind of a richer mix of activity. Okay, so now if we just move on to the 4 clusters of clinical learning, and then the 4 pillars of professional practice. So the 4 clusters of clinical learning have been defined as professionalism, clinical skills, person and patient-centered care, and evidence-informed practice. And then the 4 pillars of professional practice, which we talked about earlier, are clinical practice, leadership. So we've taken out the management bit, although that's probably still relevant, but we've tweaked the wording. Clinical practice, leadership, evidence research and development, and facilitating learning. And because the learner statements have been written to encompass these, you can see that as you work through the activity, there's built-in options to do things differently. And then for each of the cluster areas, which are in the center of this diagram, and the 4 pillars of clinical professional practice around the outside. And the way that I visualize this is that if you imagine the inner circle spinning and then landing on one of those pillars, and then you would provide activity that would complement both the pillar that you've landed on and the cluster area. And for each one of these, there is a series of activity, and it tells you how it's mapped to these 4 pillars and to the cluster areas. And then back to this original diagram, where we've got the learning statements. So the learning statements, which are phrased as opportunities for the learner, mapped to the HCPC SOPs. And then the 4 clusters mapped to those learning statements. And then for each one, there's a series of different activity, which then could be placed to tally together and lock together the 4 cluster areas and the 4 pillars of professional practice. And that's the framework in a nutshell. So there will be a resource section within the framework, and we're also building a series of cases to support, so case studies to support the framework. So if you have any story to share that we could write up for the framework as case studies, we're particularly interested in areas like simulation and examples of peer-to-peer and near-peer supervision examples. And if you have any of those, please do get in touch because we're looking to build in some particular examples throughout the framework. So that's the end of the presentation, and I think we now have some time for questions. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Bev, for that wonderful presentation. I think there's a lot to unpack here, and I'm open to seeing how the Q&A goes. So we'll have a few more minutes, and I'm really grateful that Bev has been able to put in the presentation in such a concise and short manner to give us an opportunity to actually discuss this framework. We do have a question in the Q&A section, but I will encourage everyone, if you have some thoughts, comments, do raise your hands and you will be given the stage to contribute to the conversation as well. The question here says, how did you determine the 12 learning statements?
Sorry, say that again, Krista.
How did you determine the 12 learning statements?
How did we determine the 12 learning statements?
Yes.
Well, from a variety of different ways. So, as I said, they're all mapped to the HCPC SOPs. So the first place to look was at the updated SOPs for September. And we used some previous work that had been shared with different groups, and it's probably worth saying it at this stage that I'm doing an equivalent piece of work for the Royal College of Podiatry. So the practice-based learning statements are actually shared between those 2 professional groups. So there's been a sort of co-collaboration in determining what they are. So they're based on sharing the information with different professional groups. So for P&O, we have shared the information with the NOMAD group. We've shared it with BHTA. We've also looked at some previous work, which was around looking at, well, then it was called a national placement document. And then also looked at the renewed SOPs to make sure that we were going to be encompassing all of the requirements for those as well.
Right. I do hope that I hope that answers that question. So another person, and everyone's being anonymous, says, are there challenges in getting HEIs to adopt and support new innovative models of placement practice? Example, 2-to-1 or 3-to-1?
Yes, is the answer to that. I mean, I think, you know, any sort of change is often challenging. But I think when it comes to PBL, I think there's, yes, HEIs are sort of one side, but also we've got our placement providers, and those 2, so HEIs and the placement providers need to come together on this, because actually it's not just about HEIs changing and adopting a different way of doing things. Actually, in practice, that needs to be reflected as well. And I think there are all sorts of challenges with this. And I guess for the placement provider, you know, one of the very common pieces of feedback that's given is around the pressures that particularly for the small and vital professions are facing in terms of retention, staff recruitment, and so that is seen as a barrier. But actually, if you look at examples perhaps for other professional groups or just pockets of trusts up and down the country that have embraced doing things differently, actually the feedback I think helps to kind of quell that potential kind of fear element about having to do something differently, having to, you know, put another layer in place in an already stressful environment. And that is that actually, you know, students do learn well together, and actually it's seen as a strength having more than one student. It's less intense for both the student, the learner, and the placement provider. And I think, as I said, it does, you know, the 2-to-1 model with careful planning can offer you know, a change in the way that we're providing the experience to our learners. So it doesn't necessarily mean that by saying we want to increase capacity and move from a 1-to-1 to a 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 model, that means that it kind of like means that you've got to double up on providing that clinical learning environment. We still need that, of course we do, but are there other opportunities that we can use for that would actually benefit both the student and the practice placement provider? For example, doing some sort of departmental audit or some sort of departmental evaluation. If you could have one of your learners doing that, that gives that learner opportunities to embrace leadership and peer-to-peer learning. It gives the department some wins in terms of that piece of work being done. And then it also gives you a second learner who could be doing their clinical skills piece. And then you could switch them so they could both experience the same activity. So I think it's about a totally different approach. But yes, there are lots of pressures and there are lots of challenges with this. But I think we have to start somewhere. And I think if we can look to where it has been successful and it has worked, I think we've got to take our inspiration from those examples.
Yeah, and we have 2 questions here, but I think I want to follow up with the last question because it was also my sentiment as well. And the person asks is, in terms of peer-to-peer learning during placement, many centers don't have a facility to offer multiple placements due to space or staff capacity. How do we look to facilitate this under this model? And I think that's something that might also come up as a challenge.
Yeah, almost certainly. I mean, I think it does all come down to the planning. So an example where you can potentially get past that if you physically have a limitation in terms of space or the staff capacity is either you can expand to potentially another department within the trust. You could put different groups of students from different professional groups together doing something. It doesn't like I said, it doesn't have to be in a clinical environment for the entirety of that learning experience. And in a direct example would be, I was speaking to a London trust last week who had put huge amounts of effort into developing leadership placements and leadership learning environments. And they were looking to expand their offering. So actually the learner isn't under their care for the whole time, but they go to that learning environment for, if they want a 5-day placement, for 2 of those 5 days, for example. So they wouldn't be within your prosthetic or orthotic area at all. They'd be completely removed, but they're still building that leadership capacity element of their learning experience. And that's a great example. And actually we're trying to use that. I'm doing some work with the South East in practice-based learning, and because the South East and London are quite close neighbours, we want to try and showcase some learners going from a South East based placement or learning environment and actually doing those 2 days in a London trust. It does take organisation, and it does take a totally different approach to practice-based learning. But they've had some great feedback, some really good feedback. So we're keen to try and expand that.
Right. And I think, like you said, it all comes down to planning, because it's quite a lot. And I think the next person who also asked the question here, linking into that, is that how could BAPO support placement supervisors in adapting these new standards of practice? What would be the incentive for them, is my own input to that, for them to adopt this practice-based learning framework?
Well, I think, like I've tried to say, I mean, I think we've got to see the bigger picture here, because we need to build a sustainable next generation of clinicians. And the scope of practice has changed and is continuing to change. And so, and this isn't something completely new. Our learners and our students have been out in clinical placement environments and practice-based learning environments the whole time. But what we're saying here now is that in recognition of how clinical practice is changing, how it has changed, and if we want to attract the right number and improve the pipeline of newcomers to the profession, and we want to retain those individuals once they've trained, and we want to offer them progression route, career progression, either whether it be climbing upwards or moving laterally, we need to provide the right environment and support for that to happen. So I think that seeing the bigger picture is one very good reason to think about adopting this and doing things slightly differently. And then I guess a more specific example would be, actually it could be that by looking at different activity, looking at kind of the leadership parts and the facilitated learning, and a different way of supervising, could actually be a win-win for an organisation or a department or a trust, because actually you could get some really good work out of it, particularly if it feeds into a student assessed piece of work or something. That quality improvement project that you haven't managed to get started because of all of the other pressures that you experience as a department, as a manager, could you get a group or a small number of learners to actually do that for you? So I think there's, at lots of different levels, there are wins to be had by changing what we're doing. But I think the key thing has to be looking at sustainability and building a sustainable profession for the future. And, I know from my own professional background that it's challenging, and we do have challenges with joiners and leavers to the profession. So the bigger picture is we need to do things differently, because we want to make sure that we have a profession for the future, but not only that it reflects the increases in the scope and the depth and the breadth of practice that our 21st century clinicians will need to be experienced in.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that as well. We have 3 questions here, and I'm hoping that once we get through them, that will be it for the night, because this has been quite an interesting conversation. Someone asks, will the framework be used to inform a standardized assessment tool for HEIs?
Well, the framework is the framework. So at the moment, it's not an assessment piece. However, having said that, this could be used as the basis for looking at standardizing assessments for students in practice. But the framework itself is not about assessment. It's about showing us how and providing a structure of how we can implement practice-based learning, which gives us a kind of modern, contemporary take on what perhaps has been quite a traditional model.
Yeah, and not to make you repeat what you've already said, but I think the last question we have here, Peter's asked the question as well, but I'll just end with that. The other question, I think you've touched on it a little bit, but just to go through it, it says, in the current HEI placement models, there's insufficient flexibility to accommodate this model. How do we arrange or facilitate inter-site peer-to-peer sessions within the current placement frameworks?
Well, I mean, it's quite a general question, and certainly, those restrictions are going to be different up and down the country, because the size of the learning environments differ. You might have a large department that has 8 orthotists or something, or you might have another department that only has 2, or only has 1, or so I think it's too much of a blanket statement to say that there isn't sufficient capacity in the system to be able to adopt this, because I think that's too general, and I think sometimes that's a reason for saying we can't offer more of what we currently offer. But actually, what we're saying here is we want to do things differently. So we want a different offering. So it's not just about, if you have a learner with you for 3 weeks, now we want you to have 2 learners with you for 3 weeks and replicate what you do for each one. Because that isn't really what the ask is here. But if you did have 2 learners, could you have one that was doing something other than what you would normally do if you only had 1, which then would enable that learner to gain a fuller breadth of experience. And is it fair on the learner? I mean, this is the other thing. Is it fair on the learner? If the direction of travel in our clinical environments is that there's an expectation that our students will be, you know, embracing the 4 pillars of professional practice as they move through their career. But actually, we're not going to tell you about that. And we're not going to give you any experience in any area other than clinical areas until you're actually a graduate and in your first job. And then suddenly you've got to try and get this whole different approach under your belt at that same stage. Is that fair? I don't think that's fair on the next generation of learners. And I think that, you know, we as experienced clinicians have got used to doing, you know, a certain set of things in a certain order. But does that make it right for the next generation? And I think it's an opportunity for the most experienced of us to look and think and stop and evaluate. Yeah, so I think it's too general to say there isn't capacity to adopt this. I think, you know, that I think there's some exploration to do to unpack what's behind that.
Yeah. And lastly, Peter's asked, what would you advise P&Os in practice placements to discuss the challenges of innovation with their chief lead AHP at the trust board level?
Well, I guess nobody knows your practice-based learning arrangement better than yourself. But I suppose what I can say is that at a system level, there will be a faculty lead, and so it's probably a good idea to make it your business to find out who they are, and also to try and, you know, look at who else within that system could you talk to about this, because there is a network to tap into in terms of, you know, doing things differently. And I think we're all being asked to look at our capacity modeling and to look at the content of what we're doing in terms of practice-based learning. And I think it's, you know, it's part of that recovery and expansion ask that we've all been asked to look at.
I think that's quite an extensive conversation that we've had here today. Peter has raised up his hand, and I'm tempted to allow him to talk because, well, we have 6 more minutes. So Peter, you have to promise that you're going to talk for 2 minutes, and then we'll round up the session today. Peter, you're up. You can unmute yourself and discuss or ask your question or comment, rather.
Is there something else like...
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you.
We can
Yes.
hear you.
I seem to be unmuting myself, then being muted back. So apologies. Yeah, just a quick one. I think your point you make, Bev, about the network is a really good one. I think a lot of those involved in placement supervision will find some of the challenges quite intimidating, because I think the idea to a lot of people of moving to a 2-to-1, 3-to-1 model can sound and feel like, well, doing twice as much or 3 times as much work. And I think where I was going with the question about speaking to chief AHPs or those within your community that are doing placement supervision in other professions is to maybe get that visibility of how others are innovating. So it's not about doing twice or 3 times the work, but it is about looking at new models and ways. So you're working smarter, using that leadership opportunity, which I think is really alien and not understood to many of those in our community. And I think it does require a bit of a mindset shift. But this is not about doing 2 or 3 times the amount of work, when you're a placement supervisor. It's about working differently in a way that we can become more productive with our placements. And I think for a lot of our folk, that'll be quite hard to grasp because they won't have seen it within their lived experience. So I do think there's an opportunity for BAPO perhaps to do some training in this area. And I think there's also an opportunity to signpost people to the other professions and see how they do it so they can learn from that. So I'll stop there.
And yeah, I mean, that's a great point, Peter, because that's another reason why to make those links with faculties, and because they're not, you know, it won't be a P&O or a podiatry lead, it will be an AHP lead. So they'll have all of those connections to help you bridge some of those gaps. And, you know, this is about us all working together. And so that's a good reason to kind of make it your business to find out who these people are. And actually, just by starting those conversations, you build up a network, and then you end up hearing and experiencing a different narrative. And there are more and more examples of how this approach is being embraced, and the outcomes are really great. You know, I was talking to somebody at one of our HEI partners who put their students, this is in podiatry, but they put their students into a leadership placement with HEE. So it was far away from the clinical environment that they might have been in, but they developed, one of the challenges for developing podiatric surgery is that there's, it's not well known when you're at the beginning of your career how you get there. And so one of the things that they did was develop a podiatric surgery guideline for those learners who were just, starting off, so they had an idea about how they could get there. So, I mean, that's a good example of how it can be a win-win, because it helps the profession at large, the bigger picture stuff, but it also had a direct impact on those learners, and it did a piece of work that was needed, So there's lots of examples, and the one that I gave you about the leadership group for the Central London Trust, they're doing it for AHPs. It's not just podiatry or physiotherapy or P&O. It's AHP, and I think sometimes we have to make it our business to go and knock on those doors so we can have a foot in the door. We can have a slice of that pie, and if we don't, then should it be the expectation that someone's always going to come and seek us out and say, why don't you come and have a look at this? I think we've got to knock on those doors as well.
Sandy has her hands up. Sandy, could you go on and conclude the session for us as you are done?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this has been a supremely interesting session. I think that there's some things that are very tantalizing that we would all like to know more about, and I think that would help us to discuss them in more depth, things around the 4 pillars of practice, and especially the clinical clusters. So thinking about the clinical learning clusters, in that gives the model that you gave there, Bev, gave lots of ideas in my head for how we could build on that and think about that within the placement experience, that would be about practice learning and not about placement. So I think that idea of the mind shift and moving to look at what clusters of learning would we be involved in, or could we be involved in, is very exciting. So just to conclude with the idea of the clinical clusters was very exciting for me.
Good.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for coming on to this Tea Time Talk. Like I said, because it's part and parcel of the workforce reform project that we're doing, it will be made available on YouTube for everyone to see. We do have another Tea Time Talk slated still on one of the workforce reform projects, which is early career guidance and resources, coming up on the 13th of March. So you can register for that once you get the notifications in your email. Also, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, as we are intending to build up content there for your use. All right, good night, everybody, and thank you so much, Bev, for today.
You're very welcome. My pleasure.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.
Good night.